No. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, so far.
Good evening. We have heard from the community following last week's meeting, and the concerns appear to be mainly centered around the reserves. Mr. Press will be presenting momentarily to explain further what the reserves are and what they can and cannot be used for in any school year. Let me reiterate from last week that the unrestricted fund balance is the only source of funds that can be used for any purpose. People want it to be easier to live on Long Island. They want less of a burden. That's fair. I want to point out, this is not the end-all be-all, but we did go out with a 0% tax levy increase 2 years ago when people were hurting. I will take responsibility for the ERS reserve in 2017, 2018. We had just arrived at Central, and in hindsight, maybe we could have done things differently. But I cannot change that at this point. However, let's not cherry pick the information that fits a narrative and ignore any of the data that does not. That would be considered classic misdirection. For example, there is a claim that our ES reserves as a percent of our total budget is higher than all surrounding districts. A Gold Coast school district mentioned last week does not have an ERS reserve, and some feel we should be like them. Okay, so we should hold almost 5% in the unassigned fund balance as they do. In addition, can we have that capital reserve that we've wanted and needed, like this other district? Should we be closer aligned to a nearby district with a lower percentage of ERS reserve in relation to its proposed 22-23 spending? Would it be reasonable for us to have a 9% unassigned fund balance as they currently have? I could go on, but I only want to make 2 final points. First, our original budget was reasonable, in line with many other districts throughout Long Island. Last, our total reserves as a percent of our original proposed budget was 17 and 1/1600%, the 18th highest out of the 28 districts that Mr. Press analyzed over the last few days, which includes several districts that are quite close to me. I didn't introduce myself, so I'll say this. My name is Dan Riemann. I'm the proud superintendent of West Hempstead. I want to now turn the floor over to Mr. Press.
Good evening, everyone. We are back yet again to talk budget. Budget work session number 2 this evening, and the board is set to adopt the budget this evening.
Joel, can you use the mic just so that sometimes in the audience they can't hear, out there, and Emily can't hear you.
Okay, is that better in the room? Sorry, I don't have a teacher's voice. I was never a teacher. No classroom voice here. All right, so budget workshop number 2. This is a required timeline by law. The board has to adopt the budget this evening. And we'll talk about timelines. There's a budget hearing next Tuesday, same place, same time. So we're going to just get into conversation about the budget. We had a lot of questions last week, as you know, at the meeting. Over the last week, I received a number of questions, mostly by email, that I tried to respond to as best as we could. In some cases, I directed people. I just felt it was better that they either show up tonight or join us remotely for the presentation where they could ask their questions. Most of the questions were very similar to the questions last week. The questions that I received during the week, they were largely around the reserves and surplus, and we're going to get into that this evening, so I will talk about that. But a lot of the stuff we're going to see this evening, it's going to be similar to what we presented last week, because it seems to be where the questions are coming from. So let's get into it. Okay. So fund balance. This has been some of the big questions. I'm not going to dig into the details as I did last week, but there are 5 categories of fund balance. Most of ours fit into the restricted category, which is the restricted reserves. Funds in those accounts, those restricted fund balance accounts, can only be spent for specific purposes as stipulated by the law. We'll get into that a little more. We have assigned fund balance that we'll talk about, and then finally the unassigned fund balance. So we're going to get into what reserve funds are. Again, reserve funds are creatures of the law. We can only create reserve funds if we are allowed to create these reserve funds by law. And we can only use funds from the reserve funds for the purposes that those restricted reserves have been created. So we have 4 reserve funds here in the district: the unemployment reserve, the employee benefit accrued liability reserve, and the 2 retirement fund reserves. So we'll go through this. We talked about this last week. Unemployment reserve, as its name indicates, can only be used for unemployment related expenses. We have about $550,000 in that reserve. We have budgeted expenses of about $75,000 for next year, but we have not budgeted for the use of any funds from the unemployment reserve. The employee benefit accrued liability reserve is for generally employee benefits paid out at termination of service, typically retirement, and for us, it's typically for the payout of unused sick days. So we've got about $3 million in that reserve. We've got about $305,000 of budgeted expense, and we've budgeted for the use of funding from the reserve of $275,000. Our ERS reserve, this is for our mandated contributions to the employee retirement system. We've got about $8 million in that reserve. We have budgeted expenses of about $875,000. We've budgeted to take funds out of the reserve in that same amount. And finally, the TRS, the Teachers Retirement System Reserve, we've got about $600,000 in that reserve. Our expenses budgeted for next year are $2.5 million. We budgeted for the use of $250,000 to come out of that reserve. Any questions about any of that so far? Okay. Assigned fund balance. Again, assigned fund balance is fund balance that is intended for a specific purpose. In this case, we have appropriated fund balance in the amount of approximately $2.5 million. This is money from the fund balance that we are using as a revenue source in the budget already for next year. And then finally, the unappropriated or assigned unappropriated fund balance. This is the fund balance that is tied to purchase orders that are still open at fiscal year end. So we carry these funds forward. Those funds are restricted for use only to cover those purchase orders. And finally, leaves us with the unassigned fund balance. This is for school districts. The law requires or caps what we can hold in this account at 4% of the subsequent year's budget. So for us, we have about $3 million in this unassigned fund balance. Out of all of the fund balance that we talked about, this is the only fund balance that does not have some sort of restriction on it. Any questions about any of that?
I just do have one question. We're going to take at the end, we're going to take questions from the audiences. At this point, the board will ask questions in between. I do have one question because we've gone through funds at this point, or some funds. So restricted reserves, just correct me if I'm wrong, even though we are able to take monies out of those reserves every year, we can only take out what the anticipated expenses are going to be. We can't just take extra money out because we want to limit the burden or anything like that, correct?
That is correct. Right. If we have, as I indicated, say for the ERS, $875,000 of expense, we can't take out $1 million just because we want to take out $1 million, not from the restricted reserves.
And the unassigned balance, that's the balance that we use for emergency purposes, like emergency repairs, like what happened at Cornwall when the student driver drove into the building, things like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, typically that's the sort of the rainy day fund. It's the emergency fund. If something were to happen, something structural at one of our buildings unexpectedly, school districts hold that the unassigned fund balance to address situations like that and any other kind of emergency that may come up during the year, something unexpected.
Thank you.
The boiler breakdown.
Right.
So just, high level overview, this is the total general fund balance as of 6/30/21. The $17.8 million that we talked about, $12.25 million of that is restricted. It's about 70% of the whole of our fund balance is restricted for the particular purposes that the reserves are established for. Unappropriated fund balance, we talked about, that's used for the open purchase orders again, so that is restricted already and already used in the budget. And appropriated fund balance, that's the fund balance that we have appropriated for use as revenue in the next year's budget. So that leaves the $3 million of the unassigned fund balance. That is the remainder of the fund balance. That's the only fund balance that is not restricted. I did, actually, I guess before we move on, I did want to make mention, I mean, Mr. Raymond mentioned it as well. You know, there's information that's been circulating specifically about the ERS reserve. I think we need to look at the whole picture. I think we can focus on one thing, and if we want to find information to fit a particular narrative, we're laying it all out here, right? This is all of the information about all of our fund balance and all of our reserves. We're not cherry picking the information that make us look good, make us look bad. The $12.25 million, as Mr. Reeman said, when I looked at the 28 school districts, including some of the school districts that were on that list that has been circulating about the ERS reserve, we're 18th out of the 28. So we're not exorbitant. We're not hoarding money here. We have reserves to allow us to cover expenses in times when the need arises, and we're going to talk more about that as I go through. So in terms of budgeted use of reserves and fund balance, we have been increasing our use of fund balance in the budget over the past few years. Additionally, we've increased our use of appropriated fund balance in our budgeting. So we've gone from a total use of fund balance and reserves of about $1.3 million to $3.8 million. The concern, is increased use of reserves and fund balance over time. It's like pulling money out of your savings account to cover ongoing expenses. At some point, you got to find another source of revenue. If you're not able to either stop taking money out of your savings account or replenish it, that money goes away as a source of revenue. This is just showing our actual use of reserves over time in the budget. This is information that's in our financial statements. So you can see it's increased over time as well. Any questions about any of that so far? No questions? Okay. All right. So proposed budget, originally proposed budget was about $71.4 million. Our revised proposed budget that we presented last week, $71.2 million. That's a reduction of about $190,000, $2.3 million budget to budget increase. In terms of the tax levy, our original tax cap was 2.14%. We originally proposed a levy at the cap, 2.14%. Our revised tax levy cap through the use of our debt service fund reduced the cap to 2.04%. What we have proposed is a levy increase of 1.64%. That is below the tax cap and within the tax cap for the 11th year in a row, which is the entire length of the existence of the tax cap. Again, this is just showing the 2.14% originally and the reduced levy that we are proposing due to the $50,000 we're using from debt service fund. I just wanted to show this here just to show the actual reduction in the levy as a dollar amount. Okay, so a lot of the questions and the information that I've been hearing and hearing about and seeing is focused on expenditures and coming in under budget for a number of years. And the claim being, well, if you come in under budget, you've got a surplus. That information only gives one side of the picture, right? If you have expenses, you've got to look at the revenue as well. Because if you don't have revenue to meet the expenses, no matter how much you come in under budget, you're not having a surplus, despite the fact that you may come in under budget. So I took the opportunity to put up on a slide here our actual 17-18 numbers, just to try to explain this. And I'm going to try, and if I'm not making myself clear, just let me know, and I will try to do better. So this is our budgeted revenue and expenditures for 17-18. At the top of that little sliver, that's our use of reserves and fund balance in 17-18. So just to zoom in at the top of that chart there, we can see the reserves and fund balance. In 17-18, our expenses did come in under budget. It's prudent budgeting. You want to come in under budget. You don't want to come in over budget because, again, as I mentioned, we cannot overspend our budget, the budget that's approved by the community. So in 17-18, our revenues came in around budget. As you can see from this graphic, the revenues come in above expenses. You have a surplus, and that's what happened in 17-18. If we fast forward to 21-22, the current school year is not over yet, but we're close. So we're forecasting at this point. But if you look, you can see that little sliver at the top of fund balance and reserves is larger than in 17-18. That's our increased use of reserves and fund balance. So our projected expenses, if we zoom in at the top of that chart as well, we're looking at a projection around $66 million in that range. Now, if you look at this chart, even if we came in at our budgeted revenue, our expenses are still above revenue at that point. So we are at that point budgeting for the use of some reserves. Our expenses were budgeted to come in around there. So you can see from this slide, hopefully, the revenues under expenditures, it's an operating deficit. What we do in that event is we actually take funds out of the reserve funds to cover that difference, which results in a reduction in the balances in our reserve funds. That is our current forecast. This is subject to change, but this is our current forecast. Any questions about any of that? Does that make sense? Did I make sense? Okay. Excellent. All right. So in terms of how we got to the 1.64, this is where our budget reductions came from. In some cases, we had some activity that happened after the adoption of the last budget or after the last budget was created. So we had some retirements that came in late that weren't captured in that budget. We had the realignment of the middle and high school into the secondary school, which again, sort of that happened late in the process. We were able to, through the restructuring of administration, realize some savings there. We had some retirements that we were able to replace. We were negotiating the teacher's contract, as you know. It's not done and approved, but we're very close, and we were able to make some adjustments in our forecast. Our original forecast was based on the projection and the proposal at the beginning of negotiations. And as we moved along, we were able to refine that. And some other, insurance premiums, again, when we budgeted based on estimates from the insurance companies. Those actuals came in. And then there was some software. In one case, we were reducing, we're not using that software or eliminating that. In another case, software we were looking at, we then decided to use a less costly alternative. So that's where the reductions came from. Any questions? Okay. Again, challenges that we faced in putting this budget together. This has not changed from the May budget. Retirement system payments, medical insurance premiums that have skyrocketed, and our transportation problem that we are all well aware of. If the budget fails again, have a correction. The number that was on the slide last week was in error. It was an error on my part. My many spreadsheets, I pulled the number from the wrong spreadsheet. So this is the actual number if a 1.64% the budget that we presented does not pass on June 21st. It would be a reduction of about $785,000 in the tax levy. Again, in the event of the contingency budget, these are some of the things that the district would consider: increasing class sizes, eliminating athletics, clubs, and extracurriculars, reducing electives, eliminating the use of facilities by outside groups, and then consolidation or combining of some bus routes, including the possibility of centralized pickup. In terms of what this looks like to the average taxpayer in the event of a failed budget the second time, the savings, I guess if you want to call it that, is about $126 for the 1 year period, or about 35 cents a day. And just sort of contrasting the two, 126 a day. At the point if the budget does fail, we would regroup. We would come up. The administration would come up with a proposed budget for the board's consideration. In terms of continuing this conversation, we have the legally required budget hearing next Tuesday. That meeting is also going to be a regular Board of Ed meeting. And then the budget revote June 21st, Tuesday, in the middle school gym where the vote always is. from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. At this point, I will entertain any further questions from the board.
So, I have a few questions, but I'll let anybody else go if you
The
have.
the only question I have is this reduced budget that we're putting forth.
Vinny, can you use the microphone, please?
I'm not loud enough. So that's my thing.
And he has to learn how to turn it on first.
It's on now.
It's all.
So the reduced, is it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's on.
Yes.
All right, the reduced budget that you're putting forth, that does not eliminate any programs or anything for the students, correct?
That's correct.
That's my only question.
Joe, is there any way, I think we could bring it down to like 1.5? What would we lose?
We've looked at that. If we go down to 1.5, what we would propose at that point is the elimination of one teaching position.
Still keep all of the programs that we have in place?
Yes.
Well, that one teaching position, does that mean like increased class size somewhere or a elective that would disappear, or you have any idea what that would mean?
Yeah, I think I would defer to
It
Mr.
would-
Raymond.
It would result in some increased class size.
I didn't hear the answer.
It would result in some increased class size.
Okay. I just want to go back one more time to the whole fund balance and reserves issue, because I think that's the biggest part of, and I do see a lot of hands out in the audience, virtually. I will get to you guys in a few minutes. I just think that there's a lot of concern and confusion about reserves. We went over it quite a few times last week as well. I just want to reiterate one more time and make sure that we're all on the same page and that we understand that all those restricted reserves, we are not able to take any money out of them, not for uncertain times or anything else, unless it's anticipated that that money is being spent on that item. So ERS, we can only take enough money out of the ERS reserve to spend on what the anticipated expense is going to be. Correct?
Yes.
So again, the only monies that are there is our essential savings account of $3 million. And if the building starts to crumble or the roof at Delaney starts to leak, that's the money that we need to use to do that stuff. I mean, not
Right.
something like if a car hit the building, that's insurance money, but we might have to lay it out first. We would need that money.
Yes. Yeah.
Just want to make sure. And again, I know Vinny just asked, Joe just asked the question about the 1.5 being an issue of losing one teaching position. But again, one teaching position might increase class sizes, but it won't take away program.
That's correct.
I'm gonna just take some, unless anybody else from the board has questions. Mr. Lazar, you had your hand up first. I see you, Miss Day, and I see the 4 in the virtual audience. So if you want to go first.
Thank you. I do have a few questions, but back to the budget from this year. So the budget for this year was $68,905,000. Of that, how much do we expect to be the difference from what the budget was and what was spent? The anticipated number.
So you're talking about what we expect to end the year at? Probably somewhere in the $66 million range.
Okay, so about $2.5 million. So one of the questions and one of the things that people are discussing, when you were talking about the fund balance, so you got the you got the teacher's retirement system. That only has about $600,000 in it right now. But we can add into that any amount from this 2 million surplus that we have can go into that account. Is that correct?
What's the 2 million surplus that you're talking about?
The 68 to 66 million?
Okay, so I guess I didn't do as good a job as I thought on my slide,
Not what
right?
you said, that,
But the revenue is coming in under the expense, so there's no surplus. Just because we come in under budget doesn't mean there's a surplus.
right, but because you're taking out of reserve funds.
Correct.
Right, but those reserve funds, you're taking it out of, which means that that money is now fungible. It can be moved around theoretically.
We're taking it out to spend it.
Yeah, you're spending the $875,000 from the from
No,
the
that's next
employee
year.
one.
That's next year.
That's-
850,000 was last year, right?
I believe
correctly.
that's the correct.
Yeah,
that's-
okay. Over 800,000.
750, I think
Right,
it was.
fine, 750. So 750 is coming out. That money has been used for just that purpose, and theoretically does not have to go back into that fund. Is that correct?
If, based on my current forecast, that the revenue excluding the reserves and fund balance is coming in lower, that would not go, that funding that we took out would not go back.
Would not have to go back. So
Correct.
theoretically, that funding can be used and move and put into the teacher's retirement one. And instead of taking out 500, it's money
No.
that's in
I
your,
think-
No,
it's your surplus
no,
of your revenues.
No. We would take money out of the reserves to cover the expenses that we had up to the expense. We wouldn't use, we wouldn't have the revenue above the expenses where there would be a surplus to put money back into the reserve.
We're spending more than we budgeted for.
And all the revenue, including the money coming out of the reserve funds that was part of the original budget, all of that together is less than $66 million. So that there's a $2 million,
The revenues excluding the reserves and fund balance.
including the revenues, including the reserves that you had budgeted to take out, which
Correct.
are only being used for that, is
Correct.
$68 million.
Correct.
Right, so there's $2 million that is quote unquote surplus, that's wherever that came from, right?
It's not because we appropriated the $2.4 million of the fund balance again for next year. So there's that appropriated fund balance that's already being accounted for in the 22-23.
Okay, so
I
at the
think-
end of this year, there will be the reserve funds will not increase?
They will not
Reserve
increase.
funds will not increase from whatever it was.
That's the current forecast. We still have some, a few weeks to go, but that's the current forecast.
Okay, because every other year, the reserve funds has increased. And that's where people have the
That's
question.
correct,
$2
but
million.
as I showed, and I tried again, if I didn't do it successfully, then that's on
It's
me.
all
But
I can see from-
the 17-18 year, I showed that the revenues came in above the expenses. The revenues excluding reserves and fund balance.
Excellent, right.
Right. So we had excess revenue coming in from the outside that we could
Right.
use to fund the reserves.
So what I'm saying is your $8 million reserve fund, you took out $750,000 of that, which does not have to go back into that account. So that becomes your surplus. It came out.
No, it's just, it came out of the reserve, but it's used for the expenses, the ERS related
Right, and
expenses.
so therefore you had other $750,000 that was available afterwards. Because again, if you have a surplus, it came from somewhere. Surplus.
If you have a surplus, but what I'm saying is I'm not forecasting a surplus.
You're not forecasting
current
any
year.
surplus of all revenues minus all expenses. So your revenues, including what you took out of the reserve funds, is $2 million less than you expect.
No, it's not.
It's
I feel like-
complicated, but this is where the questions are coming from, that people are gonna see the money theoretically go back into those reserve funds, and they're like, why can't that be used towards the next year? And I understand you can't just put it towards the next year. But if you need, in the teacher's reserve fund, you need $2.5 million, and you're only taking out $500,000 or $250,000, if you made that fund go from $600,000 to $1.6 million, and you took out the extra $1 million to pay for the TSA, the teacher's reserve fund for next year, all of a sudden you have enough money and you have it in the right places, and you didn't do anything against any of the laws.
It's really not how it works. It's not that we take money out and we have, the fund balance and we can use that, right? Where we reach a situation where we have funding to put back in the reserves is where the revenue that comes in excluding the fund balance and the use of reserves exceeds the expenses.
Only excluding all the reserves.
Correct.
That's one question. I still need to go through and understand it fully because I'm still a little confused. The other question that lots of people are asking, and this has not been thrown out there, but I'm going to throw it out there because people ask this question all the time, and it could be wrong. West Hempstead School District has 6 buildings. One of them we lease or rent or whatever to, on Eagle Avenue. From numbers that people showed, and I don't know if it's accurate, it said with all 6 buildings, is seats for 4,000 students. That building, I think, is about 600 or so students. People are asking, if we have less than 2,000 students, do we need to continue with all 5 buildings going forward, or can we rent another one of the buildings, bringing revenue in and decreasing expenses? That's a question that people are asking, that they've asked for years, and they decided to attack this budget with that question. So that's something that we should make sure people understand what that means to everybody. So that's why I wanted to bring it.
Well, I mean, we haven't had the conversation about that. What I do know is that our elementary buildings are packed. So we, to my understanding, we
Right.
couldn't close.
We could not close. All 3 of the elementary buildings are almost at capacity. I mean, you know, every classroom is being utilized, whether it's for classroom space, correct me if I'm wrong, or special services or whatever. And even the middle school and high school, I mean, we have teachers here that, you know, work in those buildings. There's not empty classrooms sitting around not being utilized. So there isn't, it's not that we have the ability to condense and close one building. You want to add to that?
That's accurate.
So 4,000 or 3,400 number left of those 5 buildings is not an accurate number of the amount of seats that are available. And wherever the information is being gotten from is incorrect or it's old, or what's the situation?
I wouldn't say that without checking, so I'd be happy to get back to you on that.
That's
I
a question
can't,
people will want to know before they're going to vote on
I'd
it.
be happy to put that on the website.
Well, we got 4,000
But the other-
students, but that, 2 other buildings.
Right, but the other issue is now that classrooms are not necessarily being utilized for it. There are different kinds of classes out there now. So classrooms are being utilized for the PAYS lab and doesn't necessarily have 30 seats in it because it's being utilized for a special service class or OT and PT and, you know, things like that, life skills or whatever the case may be.
Right, so in the middle school, high school, for example, and Ms. Karas can nod her head and correct me if I'm wrong. We have 2 811 classrooms, right? So that's a classroom that's gone. Not gone, but you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Because- But there's only 8 students there, right? 2 811s. No, in the secondary plant,
One.
1 8.
One.
I apologize.
The
1
second
8.
one's moving on after next year
Ah.
to the
Thank
7th, 9 through 12.
2 1211.
At the yes,
Secondary plant, goes
Correct.
secondary plant, right? And there's 2 15 ones.
correct.
So as you can see, those are not your, a
It's in
typical
a-
size high school classroom, it's typical size secondary class, because they're special ed classes, right? So we're still using these rooms, right?
Mhm.
And Ms. Brome, President Brome, mentioned that we create a PAYS lab. Now, just keep it very simple. PAYS lab is a space where more special ed students learn occupation. So we need that space to do that work. So, you know, when we went to school looked one way.
Mhm.
Now, as you know, you have school looks different. So I'd be happy to get to that figure in terms of capacity, I guess we call it. But we have to keep in mind that things just look different now than they did.
Right, which is why I want to make sure that it gets put onto maybe the website or wherever, so
Sure.
everyone can see it before the vote, because it's going to be something important. And
We'll work
with
on
that said, because if there is questions and stuff like that, there are questions about a couple of new positions that are being filled, about $350,000 worth of new positions that are being filled. According to what I'm reading on.
One new position next year, that's a custodian at the pre-K. which
And then
we have to
there's
do
a
by-
counselor and 2 social workers at George Washington,
No,
unless I'm reading it wrong over here.
No, those are-
Their budget over here. and
This is,
Oh.
okay, and this is part of my concern. People are seeing numbers and they're spreading information like wildfire. No, and I appreciate that you're here asking the question, because there are people that are not, and they're putting numbers out and giving people the misimpression. In some cases like that, we are relocating people into either correct codes where they should have been, or people are shifting themselves. So when when you see a line with a budgeted amount where there wasn't a budgeted amount for the prior year, doesn't mean it's a new position. So I appreciate that you asked the question, because it's not. We've reallocated, in part, it's due to the new transparency requirements, the reporting requirements. from the state and from the federal government. We have to report spending by building. So as we go through, and that's something that's relatively new, as we go through over the last couple of years, you would have seen situations like that where we may have created new budget codes where there weren't codes before. Yeah, so the only new position that we included, and this is part of my budget presentations, was the custodian for the pre-K. That's the only new position.
And so also, if it could be put out before the vote, is where those positions came from, so people understand. Because again, everyone told me last week, read the budget.
Right.
So I read the budget. Therefore, there's questions. And again, people that aren't asking the questions, or they're not asking directly the questions, that's why I'm trying to ask
Yes.
what I hear people talking about and not what they're actually saying necessarily, because they're saying different
That's
things.
fair,
So
but-
those are important things, so.
Yes.
Over the last few years, the state has, because parents and families and guardians have questions, the state has put into this new effect the financial transparency idea, right? So that everyone kind of knows. It doesn't affect a district like ours, which is what we consider a Princeton model. I'm not going to use names of other districts, but take District X that has 4 elementary schools, right? They want to make sure, you highlight the theory of this whole new idea of financial transparency.
Mr. Ringer, I'm sorry, can you use your mic, because I can't really read your lips.
I got you.
The press is standing in front of you. I'm like trying to hear
Stand
you.
over
It's
it.
a
Joel
little
lost audio,
choppy.
so she can't
Oh,
hear
you, please, sir.
Where would you like me to go? Never mind, I'm sorry.
Let's go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
So I'll start again, keep it brief. So the state wants to make sure that all school districts are being financially transparent. Good idea, no problem. It applies to all school districts, but it affects each district differently, right? Where our district uses a Princeton model, right? We have a pre-KK center, primary center, which is Cornwall Avenue, which is 1 to 3, intermediate center 4 to 6, and a lot of secondary plan 7 to 12. Take a different schools district, District X, that has 4 elementary schools. There might be a concern in theory that building 1 is getting more funding than building 3. They don't want that. They want to make sure it's equitable based on what students need. That's the whole idea behind this financial transparency. So we continually make sure that we are budgeting the money in the right codes. So if you look back a few years ago, there was a massive amount, and there was a lot of questions from the table as to, why is this 0 now when last year was $300,000? Because that was the year when a lot of it took place. So if you look back, you'll see that over the past few years that this has occurred.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mrs. Day, you had a question?
I was gonna say, like,
Hey, speak up,
Mrs.
I
Day.
can't
We
hear.
can't hear you.
Just to speak, just so we can hear you.
okay. Very loud,
Now
yes,
we're
I'm
good.
sure everyone will be able to hear me. But, as far as like this slide that you went over with the revenue comparatively to our annual expenses, I think that was a little confusing because you kept saying that like our expenses are kind of outpacing our revenue. But somehow we have this revenue and it's like, it's not being budgeted for, is what you're saying, in certain areas such as the let me finish.
Okay.
Such as in the ERS, right? We're saying like, okay, well, this is what is here, right? 8 million plus, but we're not budgeting for it in this year's budget. Is that not correct?
No, so do you want to,
Yeah,
try to
so-
make that a little clearer?
Real
Okay.
quick, for the ERS, right? Because last board meeting, I was asking, well, how are those funds getting there? And you were saying that we're not adding any additional money from the upcoming budget into the ERS. So that's not correct, you're saying?
No, that's correct.
That's
We don't
what I was-
budget to add.
That's,
It's only what's ever left over at the end of the paycheck. Let's say the whole budget is your paycheck. At the end of the month, whatever's left over in your paycheck goes into the reserves, but it's really the end of the year. That's the easiest way to put it. So we don't budget to put money into those reserves. But whatever's left over, if our revenues come in above our expenses, that money has to then be distributed into those reserves.
I understand
Okay.
everything that you just said. And I think what I'm saying, I don't know if you're misunderstanding me,
Apparently,
for the ERS fund.
Right.
For this past year, the upcoming year, we're saying 875,000 was used annually, correct?
Is going to be used
going
this
to be
year
used
for
for
the
the
expenses
upcoming-
for this year.
Correct.
Right.
Now, the 8 million that is currently in there, you said that we are not budgeting for that amount for this upcoming budget.
Not budgeting to add to what's in there, yes.
Yes.
Right.
Not budgeting
To add.
to that amount. However, when we take money from there annually, whatever's left over at the end, like you pay all your bills and whatever's remaining, right, like you're saying,
Right.
have the propensity to possibly enter into that to increase that amount again.
It could, but I would think that we would put it in a reserve fund that doesn't have as much funding. It's usually, if I'm not mistaken, just only because I started answering it, I guess I should finish my statement and make sure that I'm doing it right anyway. It's usually that we fund them to a percentage of what the outpay could be overall, if we had to pay out everybody at one time, sort of thing. So the plan is not to put money into that reserve. I mean, we didn't budget to have money left over at the end to put money in that reserve. But when there's money left over, say there's $200 left at the end of the year, that $200 could be split up over all those reserves. It's just a matter of where the money should go.
Well, it wouldn't be split up across all of the reserves if it wasn't needed across all the reserves.
No,
right?
that's why I'm
To the
saying it
area.
might go into the TRS reserve versus going into ERS reserve, because the TRS reserve is only a new reserve and it has less money in it.
But from what I'm seeing from the slide, it looks like we did create a line item to be allocated for the TRS, to be budgeted in for the TRS, but not for the ERS.
Got it.
If you
No,
want to go
that's-
back, I believe it was,
That's, those slides that I put up there were showing the balance current in the reserve, our budgeted expense in the budget for next year, and then our use of funds from the reserve, not budgeted funds to put into the reserve. It's the budgeted use of funds from the reserve to cover the expense.
I thought I saw 3 areas. I thought I saw the amount that's currently in there, the annual amount that gets utilized towards that particular categorical area, and then the amount that's being appropriated for the upcoming year. Am I?
That's what I'm saying,
No,
but not to fund the
She's
budget.
using the word differently than you.
Okay,
Right.
What you're saying for the appropriated year is really our expense for that year.
Correct.
It's not to go back into that reserve fund, it's what we're paying out.
So what you're paying out is coming from what's budgeted, but not what's already there?
Okay, so this is the amount I'm gonna do
Can
it
we
this
go
way
back
because
to
it's
the
the
slide
easiest.
just
Can you
so
put
that
the
we
slide,
Yeah, where we
The thing
have
back up.
TRS.
But so,
I don't remember.
let's say there's $8 million in that reserve fund, okay? The annual expense for this year is estimated to be anticipated to be $875,000,
Correct.
okay? So that we're ready on. The $875,000 that's in the other spot is how much we're taking out of the 8 million to pay the 875,000. That, we're taking that out of the 8 million. So,
Not that one.
TRS.
Not that one? I apologize.
It's not that
Two and a
one.
half
oh, the
It's
million.
TRS
Yeah,
reserve?
with the 2.5
It
million.
has ERS,
There you go.
TRS, it has all of the.
No, she wants the one with all the pages on it.
Correct.
Oh,
With all of the.
I'm gonna point
you
it.
have it? Oh, let me do it.
This
Well,
one,
it's just because
This
we
one.
go
This one?
through it.
this one, Joel.
Yeah, she's got.
yeah.
Can't see that far.
I'm like, I'll just stand here like this.
What are these?
So,
Is that the slide you're talking about?
No.
no, it's this one, Joel.
Try the
This one
It
with
has
the
like
red
three-
boxes on it.
That's the same one.
Oh.
Keep going.
All right, so then, not so much.
It has a 600,000, 250,000, and a 2.5 million.
Oh, go to the next one, yeah. This one?
That.
Oh.
No, not that one.
Use it.
It would help if we had a copy of the slideshow, because then I could revert back to it. I can't.
Okay, so the next one that says use of reserves over time is the only other one that has them all in there.
I think you're talking about the one where there's $2.5 million needing to be spent for the TRS.
Okay.
But they're only taking 250,000
That
out
was the
from the
first one.
current reserve because there's only 600,000 in there. So the regular revenue from taxes and whatever else has to pay the other
This
two
one?
and a quarter
Okay,
million.
this one.
This one?
Yeah.
This was not $8 million, that's why.
No, that wasn't I was talking
Okay.
about both the ERS and the TRS.
Okay.
So that's why I
So
said.
they're all
2
set up the same. The left column is what's currently in the reserve. The middle column is the expense that we're budgeting for next year.
Okay.
And then the right column is what we're budgeted use of reserve,
Okay,
not budgeted to put back in, it's use of money coming out of the reserve to
gotcha.
cover the expense.
Okay, gotcha.
That's the expense estimated in the budget.
Yeah, I guess we
This
went
side.
through that one so far. I could see now. We went through it kind of quick, so I wasn't.
Okay,
Okay, I follow along.
okay.
Now, another thing I just want to clarify, so these reserve funds are being replenished based on anything that is remaining after all of the expenses are paid, right?
If our,
Now, I'm a
reserves
little
come in
concerned too, because you're saying that our expenses are exceeding our revenue, so I'm thinking now maybe that means that we're spending too much. If we're outpacing what we have reserve-wise, or in terms of revenue, and what our expenditures are coming out to be, because you're saying that you're forecasting us not having a surplus and kind of exceeding what the revenue is. And that's a little concerning to me too.
So that's what reserves are there for these situations where revenue may not come in to meet expenditures. I'm not as concerned about it, I know for a 1-year time period. If this were to recur over a number of years, I would be more concerned. But at this point, because our reserves are healthy, I'm not concerned about this as a 1-time thing.
Yeah, because I just feel like as a resident, I mean, I don't really have a great overview of like what areas where we might be expending more than maybe, we need to, and maybe we could possibly be breaking that up over a couple of years as opposed to trying to achieve all of these things in 1 year and put us in a position like that. Like you said, you're not concerned about it now, but if it's a reoccurrence, then it can be an issue. So that's one thing. And then another thing, Mr. Reeman, for the one teacher that you were saying could decrease the class size, or we could lose one teacher. You were saying we could
Increase the class.
Yeah, could increase the class size. Does the teacher have to necessarily be a classroom teacher, or could it possibly be a service provider? Or, like if we have 2 or 3 particular service providers, as opposed to taking a classroom teacher and increasing, is that a possibility?
Sorry. I appreciate what you're saying. We did look at that. Before we make any final decision, we'd look at everything. We don't overstaff service providers. Typically, we're right there on the mark. And I have to be honest with you, in the summer, because we have CSEs in the summer, Ms. Karras, my phone will usually ring midsummer, and the phone call will be centered around we need a little bit more speech, for example. So we don't tend to over budget for service providers. I think right now, the way it would be, this would be fine. We're not talking about taking a class of 20 and going to a class of 4. So if that were to be the case, I think we'd be okay right now. But again, as Mr. Preston said, this trend continues, and the budget is not successful as we continue to move forward. Again, I'm going to go back to when I was principal of the high school. It was my first or second year. We had to access 10 teachers. It's hard to run a building minus 10 teachers. Our staff works very hard, and very proud of the work they do every day. And one is okay. And again, anyone who was here, and I believe you were here as well, I could be wrong, I apologize. When we were talking about consolidating the 2 middle school and high school into a secondary plant, we will, over the next 2 years, we want to look at, that's part of, right?
What was that?
We want to look at efficiencies and see where we can be more, effective improvements. And as that time comes, we will address those and those concerns. We just didn't want to do it willy-nilly because, again, I'll review the story quickly. I was handed 10 envelopes. We accessed 10 teachers. And by the end of the summer, 6 or 7, I don't recall at this point, we had to bring them back. But it wasn't as big a savings as you would hope, right? So if we are going to not replace teachers through attrition or retirement, right? We want to make sure that we don't have to replace them down the road, right? It's because we don't need that. Has to be smart. So I'd rather take it slower and do it over a few years versus when it happened the last time. That's a learning experience that I took.
Mrs. Hoffman, you
Thank
had a
you. And then, lastly, this is the last question. For the ERS and some of the other, line items, the gentleman here, was bringing up what we have access to on the district website as far as the budget is concerned and where the appropriation of funds are going. We can only ask questions on the information that we're presented with. So, I'm glad that he did ask the question about these additions, to the district in terms of teachers, custodial staff, et cetera, because we wouldn't know that you guys were reassigning those code changes unless something was indicated, some type of asterisk, on the bottom of the budget, kind of indicative of that. But now that's just one thing for that. The ERS from 2019 to 2020, we're looking at 110K, right? And then from 2019 to 2020, and then 2020 to 2021, it goes up like over 600,000. What within that time frame contributed to that big jump?
What we took a look at what was going on in terms of revenue and expenditures. And part of that was, we were adding funds into the reserves to the point where we're comfortable that they were healthy, so that we could use more from the reserves to cover those expenses. And part of it, in all honesty, is the explosion in some of our expenses, particularly in the areas, this year coming up, we talked about medical insurance and the retirement contributions and transportation. Transportation has been increasing, as I indicated, in the range of $1 million a year for the last 3 years. So puts a little bit of a pressure on the general revenue that's not increasing at that same rate. We find another source to cover those expenses.
Did
So
the state not increase the funding in the transportation area this year? Because I don't know, I thought that I saw that in the educator and the breakdown, that they had increased the funding to the districts for transportation costs. I think it was like 850K, if I'm not mistaken.
no, that's the budgeted increase in transportation for 2023. That's my budgeted increase, was 850,000.
Okay, so the state didn't increase their aid to us in that year.
We received additional transportation aid, but that's a lagging indicator, so not $850,000.
Do you have the number?
Not off the top of my head. The increase going into next year is probably about $300,000, I think, in additional transportation aid, based on our expenses from the current year, right? So 22-23 transportation aid is based on 21-22 expenses. So that will go up because of our expenses. We did receive additional foundation aid, but again, we received $1 million of additional foundation aid, which is part of state aid, but our transportation expenses are eating up almost all of that. On top of the other increases that I showed in terms of medical insurance and retirement contributions and other expenses that have increased. So we did get additional aid, but not enough in and of itself to cover the increased costs. Additionally, during the current year, we got hit with those medical insurance increases this year, 21-22. We also got hit with increases like everyone else did in fuel costs and other things due to inflation. So those costs increased as well.
Mrs. Hoffman, you had a question?
Yeah, so for over 10 years, I served on the NICE TRS committee. So I got to know all of the TRS board members. So I made a call to one of them today, just to have clarity, because I think what we need is understanding that the ERS you can have a reserve. It's a percent, total percent, correct?
The ERS?
Is there a percent cap on the
No,
ERS?
TRS has a cap.
Yes, the TRS is a percentage of the ERS.
No. TRS is capped, we can contribute 2% a year based on salaries of those in that TRS system,
Right,
and it's capped at a maximum of 10%.
10% of the TRS, of the ERS?
No,
or total
10% of the
Total expenditures?
salary, yeah.
Okay. But no matter what, you cannot move the TRS or the ERS reserve anywhere else but amongst each other.
That's correct.
But are you telling me there's no cap for the ERS?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Double check that, because I thought there was a cap on the ERS that you can put into that reserve.
I'll double check, but I've looked and I haven't seen
I only
anything
spoke
about a cap.
to a board member from the TRS, so he wasn't sure, he thought there was a cap, but he knows there is a cap for the TRS.
Well, yes, and I'm sure if there were a cap, our auditors would have told us
Mhm.
if we were at or approaching, but we'll check.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna go virtual here for a minute, so just bear with me if I say it wrong or if I miss you, I'm gonna just have to keep scrolling up and down. So, Mitch, you've had your hand up for a while. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Press. I've been observing your presentations for some time now, and I'm impressed with your patience and how articulate you are, and I assure you that I'm not the only one that appreciates it. And I'll certainly appreciate all the volunteer work that I'm seeing on the board. And so let me start with that. Thank you very much to all of you. Okay, so I have a series of questions, and I want to keep them simple, and hopefully the answer, the question should be really brief, hopefully on my part, and hopefully the answers, if possible, can be as brief as possible. So first of all, over the last 10 years, is it the case that there has always been some unassigned fund balance each year?
You know what, I haven't looked back that far. I would venture to say yes, although I'm only here 4 years, so I don't have a long history. I don't know if anyone else.
Fair enough. Over the last 4 years, has there been an unassigned fund balance?
Yes.
Okay. Now, is it the case that in each of the last 4 years, that unassigned fund balance has been termed or used or allocated as a rainy day fund for the next year?
I don't know that I would necessarily agree with the designation you gave it. But it's there. The unassigned fund balance is there in the event of emergency, so it's not tapped into unless there's an emergency.
Okay. Now, it goes without saying that you cannot anticipate how much, if any, unassigned fund balance there would be. And just for the audience, the term is unassigned fund balance, but I think many have used the term surplus. So is it okay if I use that term?
You can use it. I won't stop you. I don't agree with the designation.
Okay, so we'll keep it unassigned. We'll keep it unassigned fund balance.
Yeah, okay.
Fair enough. So is it the case that the unassigned fund balance is only used for emergencies, yet the board does not know, and they can't know at the beginning of the year when they prepare the budget whether there even will be an unassigned fund balance? Is that correct?
Going into the next year, I guess you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. I suppose that's fair.
Right, because you couldn't know, right? How could you know? The whole idea is you're trying to be as conservative as possible, and you certainly, can't know if there'll be anything left over. Correct?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
All
right.
Mitch, I'm sorry, can I just stop you for 1 second? Because I think we're talking about two different things.
Sure.
So the unassigned fund, let me try to speak. The unassigned fund balance is the monies that we already have in our rainy day account that people use, whatever. The monies you're talking about, the surplus, is what again, we don't really like that word, but the monies that you're talking about is what's left over from revenue at the end of the year after expenses. They're two different things. That money could go into the unassigned fund balance at the end of the year if it's left over. But yes, if you're talking about that surplus, I guess, so to speak.
Okay, good. You see, that's the consult. Okay, good. So I'm happy you did that because I really would like now to use that term surplus. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. So, that's good. You're great. I love how you always step in and clarify things. Okay. So with respect to the surplus, so we don't know, the board can't know whether there'll be a surplus at the end of each year, correct?
Correct.
Good. So the question I have, focusing on this year, which is maybe unique. Why is it unique? Because this year, the first budget was voted down, and so the board has much more insight as to how much money will be left over by the end of the year, because we're closer to that date. So it's sort of a unique situation, but I think it's helpful to focus on this year. And after all, we are talking about this year. So with respect to this year, given that we have $3 million approximately of a surplus, now that may change, but right now that's how it is. Why is the board so quick to write off using 760,000, or let's say 800,000, let's use a round number, to avoid any cuts, and at the same time, even assuming 250K for structural repairs, the board will still have over $2 million or around $2 million as a surplus, given especially that we didn't even know we would have a surplus in the first place. And before you answer that, I think it's very important to add one point, and I'm sorry, this might be the longer question, but I asked the board to consider, how people view the surplus. For example, I have a neighbor, I won't name her name. She didn't give me her permission, but I just want to share this with you. She's an individual on fixed income. Her income doesn't go up every year, or it goes up in a negligible amount. And so for her, a choice between padding the surplus each year, at least for the last 4 years, versus reducing this, allowing her to have money to buy milk and bread is a no-brainer. So we can't look at, especially this situation, in a vacuum. We have to recognize that cumulatively, the amount of money each year, this small increase, and it's great to compare the cuts versus how little it costs. But we also have to remember the people behind it, everyone else in the community, not financially privileged like perhaps some of us are, who each year are being hit with this increase. And it's truly detrimental to their lives. It's not 2 pairs of shoes, it's 2 gallons of milk. And so, again, I go back to the question, why is the board so quick to write off using $775,000 out of $3 million that we didn't even know we would have, and state that, well, all of it has to be a rainy day fund? I'm sorry for the long question. Please go ahead.
That's okay. And I'm going to let Mr. Press touch on this. But again, I think we're back to where you're using 2 different things to describe. You're using one word to describe 2 different items. The $3 million is not a surplus. The $3 million is not going to be a surplus at the end of this year's budget. The $3 million is in an account currently. That has nothing to do with this year's revenue versus expenses. And I think what other people are not understanding is when you say it's only $2 million or it's $2 million, from somebody who's been sitting on this side of a lot of construction meetings over the last 3 years, one crack in a wall is, $1 million worth of repair. The roof at Marion Delaney, should it begin to leak, I mean, we've had people come in, it's millions of dollars to repair that roof, which is why it's not been repaired yet, because we don't have the money to do it. So that little bit of money that I wish I had that little bit of money, but that little bit of money is not the surplus in this year's budget. So again, I'm going to let Mr. Press speak to that as well.
Yeah, and I think, if we think about the $3 million as if you think about it in your individual capacity, the experts will tell you to keep a certain number of months of your monthly expenses in an account. That's the way I think of this. It's just if there's something that comes up that we can't cover, that's what that $3 million is. To take out $800,000, just using a round number, if the budget fails, and leaving, $2.2 million, the problem there becomes we now have $800,000 of expense that we have to cover next year that we don't have the revenue for because we took the money out of our savings account to cover it. So next year, we're in the same situation. If we don't have the revenue coming in, we've got to take another $800,000 out of the savings account to cover that expense. And then in 3 years, it's gone and we've got nothing. In the interim, next year, something happens and we need to repair a roof at Delaney or something like that. We don't have that available. So it's not fiscally prudent to budget for the use of essentially one-time funds, reserve funds, fund balance for recurring expenses.
Okay, so I think that's a very fair point, and I understand it. So really, it becomes a question of priorities. Should we focus on, assuming that risk that maybe we will need to exhaust all 3 million, or do we rely on the fact that for the last, from what I can tell, 4 years, and I'll use that number, every single year, there actually has been some sort of surplus that ended up into that emergency rainy day fund account. And so my position would be, and I understand you very clearly, I just wanted others to hear this as well. And I'm happy that we had this, we really focused on, because I think it's very clear now, the two sides of this, at least from my perspective. Now, I'm also, if I may, Mr. Press, I want to follow up just, why does one can never, one rule we know is that just because something was the case in the past, it certainly doesn't guarantee a future outcome. But I'm curious, from the board's perspective, if in fact there's been money left over each year over the last 4 years, then why does the board assume that if we take some of that money, there won't be money left over after the end of this coming year?
The issue I think that we're not following is that we're not assuming there could be, well, right now we're projecting that there probably wouldn't be, but not that we're assuming that there won't be money left over at the end of the year. But if you have, a recurring car payment and you just keep taking all the money out of your savings account instead of trying to find a way to make the money to pay that car payment, then when you run out of money, they're going to take the car away from you. Like, I don't know if that's the easiest way to explain that.
No, I understand. I understand. We're really going.
Sir, only because I want to try to get to the other people, and we do have, we unfortunately have a hard stop in a little bit. So there are about 5 or 6 other people that have questions. I also want to just reiterate that, a couple of years back, probably about 10 or 11 years ago, the board and the administration did decide to spend down the use of reserve funds to the point where they depleted the reserves in a similar fashion. And the following year tried to go out with a 9-point-something% budget because there was no way to cover those recurring costs anymore. And honestly, I don't believe that it would be prudent for this board at any point to come out and ask the community to pass a 9-point-anything budget. We're barely asking to pass a 2.14% budget.
Right.
So we are budgeting fiscally responsibly and trying to do as best we can. Trust me, I live here. I don't want my taxes to go up. I have to pay them every year. My mother-in-law lives here. She's on a fixed income. I fully understand it, but there has to be the ability to make those costs remain in check.
Right. So I guess I would conclude with a comment, because I'm sure there are others. The way I see it is, there's been a surplus or leftover money every single year, at least for the last 4 years. And I think it looks, from what I can tell, it's growing. I might be wrong, but I think that it's prudent to take into account those that are, in financial trouble, and allocate a small part of that, not a big part, but a small part of that to avoid the cuts that you're referring to. But I think I don't want to go in circles. I really appreciate your time. Thanks to the board again, and good luck with your service.
You're welcome. And I do understand what you're saying. I just want to reiterate on behalf of the board as well that the last 2 years, you really can't look at those numbers and say, yes, there's been a surplus. But the 2 years prior to this year, when school was either not open or open at a minimal thing where there were no sports and whatever, we budgeted to have everything as a normal school year. But because of COVID, so much did come in under expense because there was either no sports, no reps, no busing, no this, and the schools were closed for a good part of 2020. So we have to remember that a lot of that surplus that we're calling it is basically because of those items. So that there's not necessarily that there would have been large surpluses or large revenue left over at the end of that year. So just so you have that out there. Go ahead.
Yeah, and if I could just add additionally,
Just let all of them ask their first questions first.
Can we do them and?
Well, I did everybody here first, so I'm gonna let them go first because everybody got to ask one question.
yeah, I do want to, point out, so a couple of things. Number one, in the 2020-21 school year, the governor originally had threatened to withhold 20% of state aid. So we did hold money in fund balance, in unassigned fund balance to cover that. We were fortunate that the governor did not follow through on his promise there. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind, and this is before my time here, but I've been around the schools long enough back home to know that there was a year where mid-year, the state cut building, state aid, right? They said, we're not paying any more state aid. So school districts, you're on your own. So we have to be prepared for those kind of situations. And, that unassigned fund balance, there is a cap on that. So we can't, well, I guess there's a cap in some districts hold 9%, even though they may not have an ERS reserve. But we do try to hold to that cap.
Mrs. Lieber, if you want to unmute yourself and just ask your question.
Hi, I have a few questions, but first I just wanted to say thank you for your time and for your service. I wanted to ask a question about the centralized bus picking up. About how many families would that be affecting?
I don't have that information off the top of my head. We can find out and we can get back to you.
And truth be told, that again, that's if the budget fails as we go forward.
What was the
Right.
If the centralized busing had to happen, how many families would it affect?
And my follow-up to that question is, where would the pickup be? Because we have Hempstead Avenue with 1 lane in each direction. We have Woodfield Road with 1 lane in each direction. Nassau Boulevard with 1 lane in each direction. Right. If you have all these additional families driving to a centralized pickup, have you thought about the impact on traffic?
Again, I don't think that anything has been, this situation was discussed once before, many, many years ago. Again, when the budget failed, there's no determination on where a pickup would be at this time based solely on the fact that we don't know if we're even going to need it. And then it would have to do with the bus companies and all of that stuff. It might not necessarily mean, a parking lot somewhere. It might just mean a lot of people on one corner versus, a lot less people on one corner. So that would all be information we would have to determine moving forward once we realize what would have to be done.
Okay, thank you. And then I have another question about the funding. Is there a capital fund to use for capital expenses?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I'm going to let Joel answer that. It is certainly something that we've been discussing.
Well, the answer is no. We do not have a capital reserve fund. That, to my mind, and I think we're one of the only, if we're not the only district that does not have a capital reserve. That is one way for us to, in those years where there is funding left over at the end of the year that we can put into reserves. That is one of those areas where there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this district. And unfortunately, we don't have the budget to cover it in the regular budget. If we had a capital reserve, we could, if there were a surplus, put funds into this capital reserve and then spend that. We would need, number one, the voters' approval to set up a capital reserve. Number two, voters' approval to spend money out of that capital reserve. But that is one way for us to address some of the surplus, and that is something that I will guarantee we put money in that capital reserve, we will spend it.
Mhm. And then just one more question. When we were comparing the ERS fund and the TRS fund, you were using 6/30/2021 numbers. I just wanted to know if you have an idea of what those fund balances are as of, let's say, March 31st, 2022.
We generally don't make adjustments to those reserves until the end of the year when we know what the general revenue is. Right now, what we're looking at from my projection is for the TRS reserve, we will use the full $250,000 and not replenish it.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Azos, you had a question as well, if you'd like to unmute.
Yes, hi. Thank you for taking my question, and thank you for your service to the community on behalf of the community. I just have one question. Last week there was a news item. I'm sure members of the board saw it, but that there was a federal grant that was awarded to West Hempstead in concert with the Delphi University in the amount of $4.2 million over 5 years. Which in my calculation amounts to about $850,000 a year for after school and, summer instruction and programming.
Right. Yes.
So, yeah, and this is just a recent, thing that just was recently awarded. It wasn't part of the original budget, but now we know that the award has been awarded to the district. I'm just wondering if there's any of those funds that can offset some of the budgeted funds in order to lower the tax levy.
No, unfortunately, from what I understand and what we've been advised, the monies in that grant are used for specific purpose and not part of our general budget.
Okay, so I know that in the budget we have line items specifically for summer instruction.
Right.
I saw there were two line items actually that added up to about $310,000. So I understand that. And by the way, I just wanted to preface this by, I know that Mr. Riemann had mentioned last week that we don't have a dedicated grant writer. So I do want to, give kudos and applaud the administrative staff for going out and applying to these grants and actually getting the funds, getting the money. But I'm just wondering, is there not a single dollar that can be offset by this money? I mean, I understand that we have to leave the lights on and they have to pay a custodian or whatever it is, and in all likelihood the grant is not going to cover that. But do you really mean to tell me that there's not a single dollar of that money that's coming in that can't offset money that prior to knowing that we got awarded this grant, that you can't offset those funds?
No, that grant is not for that purpose that you're speaking of in the line items that are in that. It's community based for if you want to discuss it, yeah.
So the $800,000 grant, I'm just going to use that round number each year. It's up to $800,000, right? It's if we use that money. We might not use that money because when we wrote the grant, we wrote it for X number of students. We also included ideas like adult ed. We included ideas for, let's say, some remediation during the school year, right? After school. And that includes, according to the grant, you have to supply snack, right? That wouldn't come from the general fund budget. That would come out of this grant. So everything related to the $800,000. And I'll go back and read it again. It was a pretty lengthy process, but my understanding is not.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
And as far as, I'll have to check this one out. You saw a line about summer. That's most likely for our special ed students who have extended year program.
Okay, so I'm sorry to interrupt, but specifically looking at instruction, I'm not talking about paying money for snacks or for special ed or for instruction. And I know the grant was specifically for, students who, needed a little bit more help, remedial instruction, whatever it is. Are you telling me that there's no money in the budget that was allocated for that now all of a sudden that we've been awarded this grant, now we're gonna spend money on that?
That's correct. If we did not secure the $800,000 grant, the things that we planned in that grant would not occur through the general fund. That is correct. Not a penny, not a dollar. Nope. The $800,000 grant is it's separate. We were very fortunate that we secured it. We're very happy that we secured it. Matter of fact, it's on our list of things to do to begin to work on, but it's separate and apart.
Okay, I know that, like a little bit earlier, you had like a little bit of an opening saying that you were going to look into it. And I know that there's, that there are rules regarding how grant money is spent. And I know that our budget is very long, 21 pages. We've got a lot of line items in there. I'm just wondering if, if you guys, as a board can take a look and see that, we're talking about not even a single dollar that can be lowered from that budget as a result of being awarded this grant.
I think the other issue that we have, Mr. Results, is that, again, it's recurring expenses. That this grant, I get it, it's a 4-year grant, and it's for community enhancement, not just the children in the building. But again,
it's both. Yeah, right. It's both.
If we take that money out of the budget and try to pay for it with the grant, what pays for it when we have to increase that money back into the budget because that grant is over? So
okay, but you're talking about 5 years down the road. Karen, you're talking about 5 years down the road. 5
years down the road, if we take certain things out every time, we're all still going to be here, and then we're going to have to pay for it again, and we're going to do
so
something.
You're leaving something in the budget now because 5 years down the road that
I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that grant was written not to be used in the general funds, in the general monies. So
okay,
it's not general budgetary purposes.
I appreciate your answer. I think it's a flawed mentality to kind of be closed-minded about it.
Okay.
I'd appreciate if you'd be open-minded to look into it.
Well, sir, I'm not even saying that we couldn't look into it for future. However, at this point right now, it's not coming out of the budget due to the fact that we have to put forth a budget to the community tonight. So there's no way for us to go back and look at that tonight because the law states that we have to put forth a budget tonight.
I just had a quick comment, just to understand, just maybe in simpler terms. So for example, you were talking about the $300,000 for the summer school, correct?
Yep.
And then in your hypothetical, using $300,000 of the $800,000 to support that program, correct?
I'm not talking about using all of it.
Well, I'm just saying,
even if we had a portion, like some overlap. If we can find some kind of overlap.
All right, so we're on the same page. So going back to what you said earlier about the grant writing, part of grant writing is saying that you're going to do something outside of the scope of what you're already doing. So part of the application, what they proposed, they were going to do extra services, not what's already included in the budget, and that's why they got the money. That they were going to go above and beyond what's already existing, not that you could use the money they already gave you to then supplement your expenses after the fact. So I think the clarification there needs to be stated because what they wrote in the grant proposal is what they have to use the money for.
Okay, that is true. At the same time, I'm assuming that it is our prerogative as a board to elect to offer summer programs or not to offer summer programs.
Yeah, my point was just that you're not going to, and probably one of the reasons why we got the grant is because we had great ideas we were going to use this money for outside of the scope of what we're already doing. So your argument is using the grant money to supplement current programs, which you can't do with that money.
And can I just add one other thing? 2 points. Number one, parent education is not as part of the general fund, and that's part of the grant. Number two, it's for the entire community of students here in West Hempstead. So it's not just for public school students. It's also for all of our students in West Hempstead. So again, that wouldn't have anything to do with the general fund. So the grant just has to be considered separate. You know, I appreciate your thought process.
Okay, so I'm trying to get through, everybody that hasn't gotten to ask their question first, just to make everybody aware, because there's quite a few people that have questions, and unfortunately, you know, we could be here for a very long time. So Mike, there's no last name on here. If you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, yes, thank you very much for this and for letting us ask questions. Two questions. The first question is, do we have any idea of, you know, current year to date, whether it be, you know, end of May or end of April or end of March, what our expenses were for 2021, 2022?
Yes, I mean, we, you know, again, the year's not over yet.
Not on.
It's not on.
Hold on. Don't broke the microphone.
That's broken my microphone. We gotta come up with.
Okay. I presented a little earlier what the projected expenditures were going to be for the end of year. It's still in flux a little bit. But we're looking to come in somewhere in the range of, you know, 2 million or so under budget, 2.5.
And so if that's the case, I'm sure this has already been asked, but if that's the case, we can't take 780,000 of that to put towards the tax levy, so we don't need to increase the tax levy for next year.
So, I mean, we addressed this sort of earlier. It's not just if we come in under budget on the expenditure side, we have to also look at the revenue coming in. The revenue does not exceed the expenses, then there isn't extra revenue that we can take from to fund this, the $780,000. Again, additionally, these solutions that are being proposed, these are one-time solutions that are taking funds from sources that are not recurring. But these are recurring expenses that we're looking to cover. It's not, you know, my job is to present a fiscally responsible budget, but to look out, and all of our jobs at the table here, to look out for the long-term interests of the district, and trying to do these short-term fixes to cover recurring expenses. It's not fiscally responsible.
Listen, agreed, but we're talking about a short-term budget for next year, not a long-term budget for 10 years from now. So I understand your point, but that we're also talking about the short-term, just to clarify that. The second question is also, I think I heard earlier that you said that we can move, and maybe I misunderstood, was that we can move between the TRS and the ERS. So is that the case, or that's not the case?
That is the case.
So, okay, so are we budgeting to put extra funds from the tax levy in the ERS or the TRS, or no? Because one of them was like 2.5 million, I remember.
Now the ERS was about 8 million. The TRS was about 600,000.
Yeah, but I think that there was a $2.5 million budget then I think it was the TRS, right?
The $2.5 million in the TRS was our projected full year expense for 22-23.
And is that coming from the tax levy?
It's largely it's coming from revenue outside of reserve funds, because we're only taking $250,000 from the TRS reserve to cover those expenses. So the rest of it has to come from other revenue sources, largely the tax levy and state aid.
So my question is, because the 8 million is such a large number, can we take 800,000 there, move it into the TRS, so we don't need to increase the tax levy for next year?
We could move money from the TRS reserve into the from the ERS reserve into the TRS reserve. We could do that.
Yeah, and that would be a way, because that 8 million is so large. If we move the 800,000 from the ERS to the TRS, then we would not need to increase the tax levy next year, and then everybody's happy.
Well, I'm not going to be happy, and I don't think long term the people at this table are going to be happy, because we keep, again, trying to take money from these savings accounts, again, not recurring revenue, to cover recurring expenses.
I mean, I wouldn't agree with your
car and pay it off over 6 years. I have $5,000 in my savings account. My payment is $500 a month. Well, I can make payments for a year.
I think like how you disagreed a little earlier with the way people use the term surplus. I would disagree with the way you just characterized that. I mean, I think that we discussed at the last meeting that the reason that we're not putting any more money into the ERS is because it is so large. Then it's not irresponsible to move some money from the ERS to the TRS if we believe the ERS is so large.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to disagree with you on that, but I can appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.
So the next person that didn't get to ask their first question yet is just signed in as guest West Hempstead. So if you could identify yourself and unmute.
Yeah, hi, it's Aaron. Sorry, I signed on late. So thanks for the presentation. Sorry, it was just a little early, so I missed some of the presentation. If it's duplicative, sorry about that. So I did hear Barbara, I believe Hafner had a question similar to I think what was just asked related to moving funds between the ERS and the TRS. And it sounded like that's something that can be done. With $8 million in the ERS, if we're saying on a yearly basis, the TRS expense, which is one of our largest expenses, is like $2.5 million. Wouldn't it make sense to move, like similar to the question before, some of that money? I know Manhasset has like a zero in ERS, and other districts have a lot less. Wouldn't it make sense to move? And I hear the future worrying about the budget upcoming, but for the coming year, where a lot of people are struggling, gas prices are at all-time high, inflation's really crushing a lot of people. For almost a one-time situation, wouldn't it make sense to move some of that money now that we know what this year is going to look like, from the ERS into the TRS, cover a large part of that $2.5 million? It sounds like only $750,000 would need to be covered, and then not raise the levy for the
upcoming year. Can I answer the question? Because you posed the question, I'd like to answer it.
Yep, sure.
We are restricted in terms of what we can move into the TRS, how we can fund the TRS to 2% of the teacher's salary per year. So we can't move $800,000 from the TRS into the ERS. I apologize for not mentioning that sooner.
The other way around.
The ERS into the TRS. Putting funds into the TRS is capped at 2% of teacher salary for the year. So we can't just move in.
Do we have that number?
Do we have what number?
Yeah, the annual number of
the 2% of the teacher's salary.
I don't have that off the top of my head.
Okay, is that something that could be posted?
It's somewhere generally in the range of about $500,000-$600,000.
$500,000 to $600,000.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, Mrs. Day, you had one question, and then I have one other gentleman with his hand up in the virtual audience.
Yeah. Okay. I had a question about the Marion Delaney building. One, how long have we known that roof needed to be fixed? Because I was told that we were supposed to vote on demo of that building in the bond that we ascertained, that we borrowed money for all of the upgrades in the district for.
Right.
Now I know it was voted down as far as like demolition of that building, which was an exorbitant cost. But as any homeowner in here might know, every 15, I would say to 20 years, a roof needs to be replaced, right? So did we check the condition of, like, when we proposed that to the residents, as far as the demo, did we reconsider, like, you know what? There are certain upgrades that might be more cost effective that need to get included.
I'm going to answer your question.
Well, I didn't ask.
Okay, finish.
Yeah, my question was, why, didn't we kind of project replacing the roof under the bond money that we borrowed for?
So because the cost to repair the building the way it needs to be repaired was actually more money than demoing the building.
No, just the roof I'm referring to.
The cost to repair the building was actually more money than demoing the building, which is why we said demo the building, keep the fields, put up, a nice playground for the community, whatever.
So are you saying that the cost to fix the roof at that building was more just to fix the roof
and demoing the building?
Or all of the repairs
that
need to be done?
It was more money. Nothing got done Marion Delaney with the bond because of the costs in order to do so. So
So
there
the
was no,
costs-
when we took Marion Delaney's demo out of the bond, we did so to make the community accept the projects that were being done. We had to take plenty of other items out as well, but yes, the costs were more than demoing the building.
I just want to be clear, because you're saying you keep going back to cost, which is plural.
The
So
cost
I'm
of
trying to-
repairing the roof was
So
more than to
singular.
demo the building.
Okay, okay.
So, and even had it not been, we would not have been able to put that cost into the bond because it wasn't in the original proposed bond that way. We could only take out stuff that was in the bond, we couldn't add back in. You understand? So the bond was put out A to Z. When you went to take stuff out, you had to take out A to Z, anything from A to Z. You couldn't put in something else.
Okay, so when you made the addendum, you could only take
Yes.
the track, okay.
So it was
And then-
definitely, we're aware that the roof needs to be done and
Yeah.
we certainly, it's something that,
Cause I was just thinking it is so high like that, and I'm not sure how many bids we got, we
Yeah.
went with large scale contracting companies or, some smaller scale contracting companies or what, because I was not part of, overseeing
they're
that.
estimated, it's estimated cost when they give it to you. They say budget for this much money, but again, the problem is now, this is where that capital reserve fund that Mr. Press and other people have been speaking of, where if we could establish moving forward, and again, not this year, obviously, a capital reserve, in the future, that's where monies could go to then repair the roof on that building.
And then, Mr. Press, I think you made a good point in saying, you don't wanna do a short-term fix to, ongoing expenses or expenditures that we have every year, because that's not fiscally responsible. So I, am in agreement with you on that, but have we considered ways that we could possibly increase our revenue? If we're missing the mark and we see that our expenditures or our annual expenses are going up outside of just, having the burden be on the taxpayer, because I think that's what could possibly be, a real solution to a possible, problem. Have there been any suggestions? Do you have any suggestions? Have we pondered any ways that we can go about possibly increasing our revenue? And I think the gentleman that's, a question for you, the gentleman, on in our virtual world, who was saying that, possibly, ascertaining that grant on more than a 4-year continuum in other areas, right, where there's a need, like they have grants for capital funds that we can look into.
We do look at different grants, and when we feel it's appropriate or we qualify, because a lot of the grants we don't qualify for, we have applied for grants. But we're not going to talk about the ones we didn't get because we didn't get them. But that's a fair point.
Yeah, so I was because I brought this up before in front of this board. I don't just come to these board meetings just once every other, 3 months or so forth. I am very invested in what's going on. And I think that is a great proposal. I know when Mr. Hogan was here, maybe decades ago, we had someone who was on the board who ascertained grants for the district. Maybe that's something that we need to look into as far as a capital reserve fund is concerned. Maybe there are grants that we can look into that are specific to capital projects that need to be, done, renovative work that needs to be done on our buildings in our district. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it myself, but these are just real life solutions that I'm trying to propose for not only me, but the board to lighten, your load too. And Mr. Press and Mr. Reeman, I know you guys have a very fresh job, and, even though we put the heat on you, we do appreciate what you guys do every day. I think we just want to be able to work collaboratively for the best solution of not only you guys, but also the residents.
Well, thank you for that. I'll speak for Mr. Press this time. He doesn't like it. He'll make a face at me. Speak for himself. We don't want, it's not pressure. It's our job. We're here to work together as a community. It's okay to disagree. That's how you get better. At times, as we try to teach the students, if there's groupthink, it doesn't work, right? So we don't mind questions. We just want to try to do what we think is best based on all the information we receive from all the different constituencies. So thank you.
I I don't really want to cut anybody short, but we have about 5 more minutes only because we do have other stuff going on. So Mitch, you have your hand up still. I don't know if you mean to have your hand up still. If you don't, could you take it down? And if you do, could you unmute yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much. Just quickly, where there is a surplus in the unassigned fund balance and that money is not exhausted, what happens the next year? So for example, we have about $3 million. What happens if that money is not used this year? Where does it go next year?
You want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, okay. The money, I mean, it stays there again, that $3 million, that's our, for lack of a better term, rainy day fund that sits essentially like if you have a personal rainy day fund, it sits there and hopefully you don't touch it until you need it. That's the equivalent here. That $3 million sits there unused until we need it.
So if there's a surplus this coming year, is that added to that 3 million?
If there's a surplus this year, which we are not forecasting, the funding can go either it can go to reserves or it can go to this unassigned fund balance. But there's a cap on the unassigned fund balance.
And in the past, have surpluses been funneled to reserved where they would have exceeded the cap?
There's no cap on the reserves with the exception of the TRS cap.
Where the surplus would cause the unassigned fund balance to exceed the cap, is the excess money then funneled to reserves?
Goes into the other reserve.
If there's, and we have held funds, like I mentioned in 2020-21 school year, when the governor threatened to withhold 20% of state aid, we held, like many districts on Long Island did, and some of them still do, we held money in excess of the 4%, that cap. After 2021, when the 20% cut did not become reality, at the end of that year, we moved those excess funds into reserves.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so at this point, I need to address the board in that we have to come up with a decision now and have a conversation in regard to Mr. Press's proposed 1.64 budget and where we stand on that and what our opinions are, because we need to pass a resolution in regard to that, those numbers and or where we're going to go with it. So I'm just going to ask for you guys to kind of have a conversation.
I agree with what Joe said earlier. I think we should, I would like to see it now.
Can you use your microphone, please?
I would like to see this no higher than the 1.5. You know, it's not a big deal, but I think the 1.5 is, to pass the budget, I think we need to be at that number or less. So whatever we have to do to get to that number without hurting programs, I'd like to see happen.
I tend to agree that if we can do so without harming program or any of the other necessities for our children, that if we can get to the 1.5 number, it would definitely benefit everybody. It's just a little bit more of an aid, but it is definitely something that we can do based on what Mr. Press said earlier.
No, I agree. And it's not, you're not firing a teacher, you're just not replacing or retiring.
Kurt, can you use your microphone, please?
Sorry. I said, you're not firing a teacher, you're just not replacing a retired one, correct? With the difference between the 1.5 and the 1.6.
Yes. Providing that's the teacher that needs to be, not, yes. Your thoughts?
I brought up 1.5, so yes, that's exactly.
I'll speak really loud. I'm okay with the 1.5. I think that the 1.6 budget was a good budget for our community, and I think it was a good budget for our students. Taking into account all the feedback, I would be okay with a 1.5% budget because we are not taking away from our students, which at the end of the day is, I think, should be our biggest focus and our highest priority. So I'd be okay with the 1.5 since it's not taking away from our students.
All right, well, that being said, we'll have to pass the adoption of the budget, but what I need from you, Joel, is the monetary number to add into the docket.
Yep. Ready?
Yeah,
So it'd be 71,135,474.
doesn't fit in my line.
That's the new amount, Press, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
Is that the new amount that he's?
That would be the amount on a 1.5% tax levy.
Okay.
And that amount
I
again is,
didn't hear it.
Okay, I'm gonna read it now, like I'm gonna pass it and then I'll read it again, what the number is. So at this point, I need a motion to move docket 1-396. And with, I have to read it.
We all know it.
Regarding the adoption of the budget for 22-23 school year. Recommendation is I, Daniel Reman, Superintendent of Schools of the West Hempstead Union Free School District of the County of Nassau, do hereby recommend that the following resolution be adopted. Resolved that pursuant to the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools that the West Hempstead Union Free School District budget for the 2022-23 school year in the amount of $71,135,474 be approved and hereby adopted by this board and authorize the placement of a proposition on the voting machines and the raising of such taxes as necessary to provide for said budget. That was a lot of words. I need a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Any question? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes. I'm going to repeat that number again and do it right this time. $71,135,474. Which is a 1.5% tax levy down from the 2.14 that the last budget went out at.
and that's a reduction of about how much from the
Initial one.
original budget?
Yeah, we had estimated initially at 150K, right?
It's the total,
The reduction from the original 2.14% budget, it's about $256,000.
256?
Yes.
That's in addition to the 250K, or is that separate?
What, 250K? What?
The amount that we discussed last.
That's the total.
The savings amount, was it?
Oh, you're talking about the money that's meant for the crack in the wall? Is that
No,
what you're talking
I'm sorry. The one that, the amount that you said, if we had to adopt the new budget, it would go down. I think.
If we had to adopt the contingency budget, you mean?
Yeah,
That-
not the contingency.
Oh, yeah, 190.
190?
1.64, now we're gonna do.
Now
Yeah,
it's,
at
now it's
1.64
256,000
256.
from the
on top of
191.
the one. That's what I'm
No.
saying.
Including, the 191 is in here.
256 total.
So it's another $60-something thousand.
Oh, got you. Okay.
And the,
Mr. Hildebrand?
and if you go on contingency, then you would still have to cut about 780,000 from the budget?
No, based on, if we cut the 67,000 to get to the 1.5%, if that budget fails, then it's an additional, the tax levy increase at 1.5% is $717,000. That would be the reduction if we were to go to zero, because we're already going to be reducing to get to the 1.5.
Right.
If that fails, it'd be another 717,000. 717,000.
Thank you.
Do you want to do the breakdown of what that amounts to annually and per day?
I believe he has it actually, but, and we will put it on the website tomorrow.
Okay.
So at this time, I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank everybody for all their questions because I think it's helpful for people to get a clearer picture of, I do think, I'm not going to lie, I still think that people have some miscommunication and misunderstanding of what reserves versus fund balance are and what is being construed as surplus. Again, I do believe that people have misinformation and a misunderstanding of what those things are. So please reach out between today and the 21st. Please make sure you attend the budget hearing next week. I do know that unfortunately it is not unfortunately, but it is a regular board meeting as well. So there'll be other stuff going on. You'll have to listen to a lot of things, but I just want to make sure that everybody is educated and aware of what's happening and that there's not a misunderstanding on what you're voting on. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to board members. Please feel free to reach out to Mr. Press or Mr. Riemann at any time. Feel free to call Miss Riley. She's just going to transfer you to one of them. But she'll say hello first. We're willing to take the questions. Again, I said it last time. The only thing I will tell you is I will not respond on social media. If you have questions, feel free to call me, text me, email me, but I don't respond to Facebook posts or any of that kind of stuff. Again, have a wonderful evening. We're sorry that you guys were here so late, but thank you for all your questions. It certainly helps for other people to hear what other people are thinking. At this time, I need a motion to move into executive session to discuss personnel.
So, second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, motion passes.